Forward Base Sawano at Xeno Island by Tactical Cat. Episode 10. Bury Me Where the Waves Foam. 3 ridiculously armored ships and the submerged coordinate sped southeast in formation, carrying the miniature version of the Fogelum Kefik along as well. After the others had caught up to the ashes, they obliterated the enemy destroyer that had shocked Sawano base into engagement. Shortly thereafter, the Admiral had convened a joint telegraphic briefing on the Sawano. So, I'm assuming everyone has read the strategy already. It's very straightforward, instructed Admiral Now to 5 miniature holograms, arrayed in a circle atop his office desk. Straightforward was the Admiral's favorite technobabble for what the bigwigs at the square were calling Operation Let's End This Damn Thing Once and for All, or Counterattack Mankind in short. But whether the Countess had grasped the intricacies of the planning and risk assessments behind these orders was unimportant. All they needed to know was how to execute what he needed done. Since we finally have the tech for it, Now explained, the soft fraternity at the square gave us the go-ahead to launch a counteroffensive. Our goal here is to obliterate the fleet at the enemy's forward base, Tridion, so I don't really care what you do with the base itself. Feel free to steal some of their gear or plans if you get the chance. No one had been particularly impressed by the scale of the operation. These were stereotypical orders, just a little on the destructive total victory side. Recent intel reports have revealed that the harbor we're after is responsible for pumping out the aquaforming goo we've been struggling with, and it sustains the boundary layer, continued Now, which is why it's the target. If we take this out, we can open the way for Admiral Nigel's fleet to do the cleanup afterward, and we'll finally have a way into the enemy territory. That makes this ultimately their last defense against us. With AZ's new armor outfit and induced magnetic fields, sailing through NNFSHTEEAT contaminated ocean was finally technologically feasible, and Admiral Now had adapted his strategic projections aptly. The Jewels could now spearhead the vanguard foray into the contaminated ocean and converge with Fleet Admiral Nigel to take down the final enemy bastion that had barred their access to the Eastern Territories for so long. It's gonna be a bit of a battle, but you all know what you're doing and what your crews are capable of. By the evening, Fleet Admiral Nigel should be joining us, so we'll have the numbers game too. It was about time these long 5 years came to an end. Also, explained Now, be sure to keep up with meteorology. It's supposed to keep clear for the week, but I really don't want to see more Halsey typhoons in the history books. A chorus of "Aye, sir," responded, and then they signed off and scattered back to their respective commands. Charging into the horizon toward the last stronghold that threatened the planet, the Countess gazed out from their bridges with discerning eyes. The vertical boundary layer was within the evening's sail from Forward Base Sawano, plus the next morning to Tridion Outpost. The trip there was spectacularly engaging, overflowing with hours and hours of shimmering, repetitive, empty blue. Era's intel report had given them a rough estimate of what sort of resistance to expect, and upon nearing flight range, the Sawano sent out a recon aircraft to survey. "Recon reports what we expected," relayed Yuki. "We're looking at about 20 to 25 total. Some archaic coastal defense ships and..." Wait, really? They caught the static interjections of, "Yes, sir, signals intel confirms it too," from a crew member, and then Yuki's voice reappeared. "They're all battleships." "So outdated," exclaimed an incredulous Toby. "Finally," interjected Thulner. "I ain't the only proponent of battleships left. This'll be fun." Toby and Yuki watched an oversized and over-armored battleship race out in front of them. Who needed formations anyway? Well, he has the right idea of it, at least, commented Toby, amused by Thulner's enthusiasm. Why don't we join in? Let's light it up! The onslaught of the Ash's artillery assaulted the outskirts of the enemy island. Missiles whirred, dirt cratered, water vaporized, and 5 of the enemy ships were incapacitated immediately. Sending out the occasional torpedo, Ken prowled beneath the waves, searching for the polluting outlet as Yuki's pilots scooped up the sky in the bend of their wings. Operations began smoothly, until the base began firing back. Their intelligence and superior technology had given the Jewels an initial advantage, but the enemy fleet was more than double the size of theirs. Confirmed hit on that one, but no penetration, reported a bridge officer. It hit the hull and deflected. As Captain Toby paced about the bridge, he listened to such incoming reports and kept a map of the situation in mind. Battleships were massively armored. Struggling with penetration was to be expected, despite how outdated they were. Captain, watch the... Toby ducked as a laser burned off a tuft of his hair. Standing cautiously, he noticed an impressively precise hole in the window and fine glass grains scattered about where the laser heat had melted it. Crap! Captain, we've got another one coming! He crouched low to the ground and braced. Keep the artillery going, Toby directed. Counterfire now! Zap! We cannot keep taking shots like that. Ha 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 ha, came a maniacal chuckle over the comms in the unpreserved acoustics of unnerving radio chatter. Their heads turned. The XLTT loomed into view, protecting the fragile Ashes with its thicker body. Thulner had taken it upon himself to test just how good AZ's armor was, and he seemed to be enjoying the meal. Ain't gonna allow that, yelled Thulner over the radio. Not to my friends. His crew was similarly enthusiastic, as his cries garnered bridge-wide cheers. Not while Admiral Now's men are here. The laser fire abated briefly, and Thulner continued. Gotta be careful out here, Toby-san. Let me take all the holes, got it? You got the lone guns anyway. What are you even doing this far up? And Toby couldn't help but chuckle. Thulner was actually the one in the rear at the moment. He seemed to have lost track of their positioning while chasing down prey. Well, at the least he was thorough. The battle continued until the evening. Sten had managed to relegate the enemy's technology into obsolescence, and slaughter ensued. It was tempting to liken the whole effort to a suppressive fire action before a marine landing, but no such landing would be needed here. The Jewels were just efficient, scarily efficient, and scorched beach and rising smoke screamed it. Once Admiral Nigel arrived, total victory would be certain. Found it, sounded a bored voice across their bridges, heading into range. Toby wheeled around from watching out the window and announced into the comms. Good timing, Ken. Take out that stuff and give us back our ocean. Let us pave the way for the greatest fleet on the seas. His bridge relayed coordinates to the others, which directed their attention to the incoming gray specks on the horizon. We made it, boys! Cried a desperate Thulner, panting inexplicably. Apparently, standing in the bridge and shipboarding was strenuous work. Thulner-san, I am curious. Why are you out of breath? You were not the one with holes in your bridge, teased Toby, and a new haircut. We aren't finished yet. Yuki refocused the mood, recon reports in hand. There are 2 coastal defense ships left. Until Adam returns with more supply, we won't be able to deal with them from the air. They had maintained air superiority from the first launch, but this was mostly due to the fact that the enemy had no air. After an entire day of constant engagement, they were out of bombs. I'll finish the job, input Thulner. already sailing around toward the south end of the base where the final ships were. "Ah, ah, ah," came a cry into the bridge. Adam must have been back with supplies. All that remained was for Ken and Thulner to finalize the operation, and they could head home. Relieved sighs ensued. It seemed like they could conclude this battle with minimal loss. "Recall the pilots immediately," rang Yuki's voice. "Get them landed and chart back east." "What is it?" responded Ken, unnerved by Yuki's unusual outburst. Something always happened after a relieved sigh. "Yuki-san, what's the problem?" asked an alerted Toby. "Thulner-san," she deferred explanation. "Don't bother with those ships, it's not—" A rumble shocked the sea surface, and the XLTT coasted to a dead stop. "We're hit," relayed Thulner, alarms blaring, steam seeping through the background. "Engine's dead. We'll repair and catch up later." There was another shot. "Y'all gotta get back home fast as you can." The ashes took fire, and there was no heroic XLTT to shield it. "Return fire," instructed Yuki, as the first of the fighters landed. "Do not hesitate." But her voice hesitated. "Even if it is Admiral Nigel." "What do you mean it's—" Ducking beneath another laser. "The Admiral!" exclaimed Toby, shocked. Yuki hardly seemed convinced of her own words, as they had no direct visibility to confirm the recon reports on which she had been acting. The artillery shots that took out the XLTT could have come from kilometers over the horizon. "As of 1844, explained Yuki cryptically, Fleet Admiral Nigel and the entire fleet of Brave the Ocean are to be considered our primary opponents." But she was simply relaying the information that Adam had reported. "That can't be right," opined Thulner. "There ain't no—" "If we stay here, we'll die," insisted Yuki, above Adam's background protesting. "There's no way 4 of us and a penguin can stand a chance against that fleet." The characteristic reality of her words arrested Thulner's body as he listened. Toby merely stared into the horizon. He had been serving under the Fleet Admiral for years at this point. As rarely as they interacted, he had grown fond of Fleet Admiral Nigel's constant enthusiasm and encouragement. Now they were to fire on a comrade and superior officer, treat him like the foes they had been struggling against together for so long. "You're saying," Thulner was the first to break through the struggle of acceptance, "that Admiral Nigel is the one firing on us at the moment?" The bombs were so loud they could barely communicate. "Yes," confirmed Yuki. "We should discuss details back at base. Advising radio silence," observed an irritated Toby. "The Admiral has our frequencies." The ensuing silence confirmed an immediate consensus. Survival had just become a matter of instinct. Any implicit coordination between them now would be an accidental product of their years in command together. Dodging fire and torpedoes, they made their way back east in an arc around Admiral Nigel's fleet, sea chariots racing the foam toward the finish line of Xeno Island. Admiral Nigel's task force remained in closing pursuit. Each shot in their direction drew nearer, betraying either proximity or specific intel on their locations. No one would be surprised if there were more moles in the fleet. Well, now that Admiral Nigel was implicated in this mess, moles had just become traitors. Bullet streaks and artillery shells ripped the sky open. Their engines whirred, straining to output maximum speed, maintain the magnetic field that held Sten's armor in place, and distill the salt out of the ocean water that it collected. "What are you talking about?" explained Yuki to a much diminished penguin, who had scurried onto the flight deck as his drug wore off. "We have the most space and the top speed thanks to the nuclear engine. We're the most logical choice out of the given options." After promptly resupplying the jewels, and with only one injection of Into the Sky remaining, Adam had decided to take shelter on the Sawano fan. "Do you see another choice?" Adam flapped his flippers, exasperated. What do you mean, I forgot?" She stared incredulously at his flipper hand. "No way." Whee! Pew! Pew! A marathon of missiles and lasers and bullet trails kindled the atmosphere above as she chased Adam out onto the deck. "You've already drained through an entire case today." But he wasn't wrong. The best way to rescue the stranded XLTT was for Adam to pick it up. Arms crossed, she tapped an anxious foot. "I won't be telling Lieutenant Angela to cook that many fish." But she was actually worried about the biological strain on his system. There had never been need to use so much stimulant before, so they had never investigated its effects in massive doses. Why would anyone deliberately overdose just to confirm its deadliness? Helplessly, she watched him dive off the deck, waving a flipper smugly back as he injected the final vial into his shoulder. They were technically the same rank, so it wasn't as if she could just order him back to the safety of reason. As a bomb plunged through the center of the deck, Adam rose a mile into the sky, splashing and stomping his way back toward Captain Thulner. Damned heroics. Over in the ashes, Toby found himself with a fire hose in hand, spraying down the bulkhead to the bridge as alarm bells pealed. It had gotten to the point that the captain had to contribute manual operations himself now. Destroyer crews were, after all, puny in comparison to the city of a carrier. Similarly, Kin's coordinate had encountered little opposition until a smiling torpedo had scraped the hull before he could fire at the waste disposal from the base. It seemed that Admiral Nigel had prepared for him too, stationing one of his submarines to protect the marine area. The submarine he had sent, the Smiling Dolphin, was known for its habit of shooting torpedoes with grinning faces painted on their tips. Ken had run into a formidable opponent, perhaps the most experienced submariner in the war. Stranded back at Tridion Base, Thulner looked out from his bridge in dismay as Adam pushed aside the waves, desperately crawling toward his broken XLTT. He could imagine the senior chief's inevitable disappointment at seeing Adam carrying an injured ship back to dock. At least the damage seemed minimal in comparison to the two halves he had sailed home a week ago. "What else should we do, Captain?" asked one of his bridge crew. He looked around at the 5 cruisers converging onto his position, Adam scrambling to catch up, and then he glanced back at his crew. Admiral Now had once joked that pilots facing imminent crash with no other options occasionally resigned themselves to praying to RNGesus. Now seemed like a good time to convert. "Press buttons," he commanded. With no way to communicate with forward base safely, the Jules churned along and split atoms at the maximum safe speed, crawling home toward Xeno Island a day away. Between them and that day was the steadily growing, most heavily armored fleet of the Federation. If Fleet Admiral Nigel had been the usual archenemy that protagonists always had to face, there would have been no threat to the overall strategy. After all, they had managed to destroy the targets at the island. But the green goo was still stealing the oceans, and the betrayal of Admiral Nigel's fleet was not only an addition to the enemy forces, but a simultaneous reduction in theirs. There had been a day, long ago, when Fleet Admiral Nigel had pinned Admiral Now's rank insignia onto his chest at the deck of his flagship, and the war gods had smiled down. The captains remembered laughing at some of his jokes during the massive, fleet-wide celebrations he had hosted. He had been so good-natured, so kind. Now it was a distant, confused memory, shocked by the recent hour's events. What did he want? Why betray the entire Earth defense fleet? How long had he been working against them? Somehow, the captains came to a tacit agreement that they would not be able to outrun Admiral Nigel's fleet. Even the giant penguin lagged behind, XLTT tabled on his flipper. Flight was hard enough, but the war gods were unsatisfied by simply routing them. A few shouts from signals intelligence declared active radio signals from behind. The fleet admiral had cut off their retreat with a flanking force. "Well, how large is it?" assessed Toby to his intel officer. I'm not sure, sir. Larger than we are. At least 20 ships." 20? We looking at carriers or cruisers here? Inquired Thulner, having received the same signal from his crew. "Should we launch," declared Yuki in emphatic syllables, "if we can maintain air superiority—" "Unadvisable, sir. They allocated carriers, too. We'd be outnumbered." "Torpedo from below?" Ken proposed to his trusted officers. "Normally I'd agree, but there—" The sonar officer paused to attend to her earpiece. "They're dropping depth charges now." They were still running from the smiling dolphin that had greeted them back at Tridion Base with a smiling torpedo. Thulner watched the rhythmic rise and fall of the horizon out the window. Conducting a war from the bridge of the XLTT, a mile up in the air, was a new experience for the entire crew. Button-pressing galore would make no difference here, and with the Sofan's pilots sheltering, none of the Jewels had any air defense, least of all his. This was not how the strategy was supposed to go. What happened to total victory? He let out a resigned sigh and unhooked Gravity Wolf from his back. Leaving his first officer in charge, he then slipped off the bridge and stepped onto the prow, feet apart, hands secured at his hips, and waited. He was waiting for the first fighters from Admiral Nigel's task force. An incapacitated ship like his all the way up here was a natural target for any pilots after easy prey. Consistent with the button-pressing philosophy, he had no intention of relinquishing his beloved ship so easily. With a smirk, as Nigel's first fighters dotted the distant blue, he hoisted Gravity Wall up into the air, its brazen disk shading the deck. "Come at us!" he yelled into the air, eyes sharp, heart pounding in preparation for the end. A lone mortal was challenging heaven. "Well, I certainly am not going to just sit here," observed Toby to his crew, inspired by Thulner's example. "Prepare till I, and keep on course." Now that was a name they had not heard in a long while. Given how much anti-air the Ashes was equipped with, Till I was usually reserved for desperate situations. Today seemed sufficiently desperate. 2 domed cylinders rose out of the circular hangars from the deck, with slit barrels jutting out past the railing. 2 jagged, crystalline blades, amplifying the chaotic, unpredictable flame in their cores, were suspended in the middle of each anti-air dome. Captain Toby had summoned his crystallized blades, self-guided, ground-to-air sword missiles that homed on and sliced through infrared heat signatures. With a command and a switch flip, the blades were propelled into the air, trailing chains behind them. They could remain suspended as long as he needed them, but they weren't fast. With just these 2, there was no way he could protect any more than the Ashes, and even then, it only secured the local airspace around it. Without Thulner's XLTT and Yuki's Sawano, he suddenly felt very vulnerable. Yuki, over on the Sawano had easily concluded that her katana could not slice enemy aircraft in two, and made the decision to remain where she had been on the bridge. She squinted out at the wall of carriers approaching them head-on from their retreat pathway. Someone had to get back to inform Admiral now. If they could just alert Sawano base, maybe they had a chance. He just needed to know what was going on. And perhaps he could... Whoosh! An enemy plane swooped just over the deck. 5 bombs fell, obliterating 10 of her own fighters. Another bomber was approaching just behind that one. Without air cover, the Sawano was going to sink. Fire sprang out on deck. Bridge communications elevated into a flurry of decision-making and order-giving. She spared the briefest glance out the window, searching for something, anything that could save the ship. At length, one final chance came to her attention. Take the laser shields down. Divert power to getting us out of here. Was that the right call? She thought. Immediately, a laser bored through the hole. What? So much for that final chance. I thought we hadn't figured out that tech yet. What is Fleet Admiral Nigel doing with... She stopped short and heaved a defeated sigh. Of course. Who knew how long the Fleet Admiral had been collaborating with the enemy? Of course he had their tech. There's nothing else I can do, she thought. She scanned the horizon, looking over to the other jewels. Smoke steamed out the cannon of the ashes. Adams, Vogel, and Kavik was too tall for them to assess how the XLTT was faring, and thanks to the radio silence imposed on them by Admiral Nigel's betrayal, no one had heard from the coordinate for minutes. At the war front, minutes contained lives. She couldn't fight the premonition that they were going to lose the war here. It could still be the right call, she assured herself. Don't despair yet. But the words were an empty hope. This will be our grave, chanted the officer attending to intel. Bury me where the waves foam, and the rocks shriek, and the storms roam. He began a quiet melody. It was an old song that had become popular amongst the crew of the Sawano a few years ago, but now it merely voiced the suppressed helplessness that pervaded the bridge. The crew joined in. Bury me when the deeps thunder, but when dawn peaks and should strands slumber, then bury, oh bury me while the wet wind blows. Bury me after clouds cry, after tides moor, after coasts dry. Bury me if my ship sails while, I ashore, my spirit fails to catch her, and I go not where she goes. All of a sudden, shadowy figures lit on the deck of each ship. Yuki ran to the edge of the bridge and looked down. The man was robed and hooded, tall but otherwise indistinct, and his right eye was obscured by a black eye patch, and he was waving frantically. As another of the enemy bombers arced down toward the deck, the figure lifted a golden katana into the air, using it to deflect the incoming airfire. "Who is that?" chatted the intel officer, shocked out of his song. A murmur arose. "Is he with us? Captain, should we arrest the—" Yuki had already disappeared. "Don't you dare stop!" yelled a hooded figure at the prow of the Ashes. He was aiming a crystalline rifle into the sky. "Whatever happens, just keep on going. You might have to drive back 2 halves of a ship." "We already saw that one," yelled Toby back to him, peering out the window. He feared more the aftermath of the senior chief than the actual danger of having his ship split in half. But he was intrigued by the notion of shooting down an aircraft with a rifle. Plip! The rifle was surprisingly silent as its bullet intercepted an engine. A firework of residue scorched the sky for a moment and trailed seaward. This mad style of combat, distant and piercing like one-man artillery, seemed unnervingly familiar. "Think about who you learned heroics from," Filner heard as the last shard of gravity wall trickled down before his eyes. He threw himself back onto the deck, unable to stand any longer. But before his eyes he could glimpse slivers of the peaceful sky through the lattice of a crystal shield. The XLTT was still safe. The mysterious man's shield had replaced gravity wall. "Your body can't take no more, so it's my turn to be the body," continued the cloaked figure's voice, in the impeccable logic of enthusiastic heroism. But on the burning deck of the So-Na-So-Fern, Yuki merely stared, with Crystallize's sheath clutched in her left hand. Fire fumed about them, but her pulse remained steady at walking rate. No one else had such elegant technique. No one else she knew had mastered the blade to this level. No one had earned the right to wield the world's most beautiful crystalline weapon. All at once, the captains realized exactly who had just flown down from dawning heaven like angels to oppose fate. Their names were engraved on the silver plaque before the mess hall at Sawano base.